This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. There have been more than 80 mass shootings in the United States so far this year. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. But gun violence isn't just limited to mass shootings. Every day, hundreds of Americans are shot in murders, suicides, and more. In Connecticut, we have some of the strongest gun laws in the United States. And yet, gun violence continues to rock communities across the state. And while Governor Ned Lamont has put forward a comprehensive and ambitious gun safety agenda, Second Amendment groups are already pushing back. Joining us now on Where We Live for a discussion on gun safety in Connecticut, I've got in person, sitting to my left, Mark Pasniokis with the CT Mirror and a great Capitol reporter, Capitol Bureau Chief for CT Mirror. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be back in the studio.
Yeah, this is like a new thing in the post-COVID world, in-person interview.
We are a tenant in your building. Our newsroom is one floor above where we're sitting. So
we cheated today.
Yeah.
And joining me on the phone, the great editor-in-chief of CT News Junkie, Christine Stewart. Good morning, Christine.
Good morning, Frankie.
Are you feeling jealous that I didn't invite you to the studio now that I've got Mark to my left?
No, you actually did invite me to the studio, and I was unable to make it. So.
Oh, that's very good, and I think we only got like
a
couple of mics anyway, so I think it works out. If you're listening to this conversation, you can join us, 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Mark, more than 10 years since the mass shooting at Sandy Hook School, the most devastating shooting that there's been and that there's been around us here in Connecticut's changed everything. What were some of the gun laws that were passed in Connecticut in the aftermath?
Well, the biggest one was the next year, which was a bipartisan bill which achieved some of the things that Senator Chris Murphy, quite frankly, is trying to do federally. And the big one was universal background checks to purchase firearms and ammunition. They're also revised a 1993 so-called assault weapon ban, which was something of a failure in that the original law banned 60 or so firearms by brand name, which is a very difficult way to legislate because the model numbers and names change. So after Sandy Hook, they went to describing the aspects, the features of firearms. So those were the two big things that came out of Sandy Hook. But the universal background checks, I think is something that has been very effective in Connecticut. At the top, you did talk about the continuing spikes in urban violence that we see, but people should also know that Connecticut from year to year tends to be in the top 10 as far as the fewest gun deaths in the United States.
Christine, so it sounds like what we have now, based on what we talked about with Mark, is we got universal background checks, we got a ban on high-capacity magazines, there's the assault weapons ban, and permits for firearms and ammunition that you have to have. Mark just hit on the fact that he feels that they've been effective here, the gun laws in Connecticut and gun control, but this did lead to some weapons being grandfathered in, as I understand it, into that bill from the 1994 ban that we had. About 80,000 weapons or so?
Yeah. So those, those pre-ban weapons are currently legal to buy and sell in Connecticut and include AR-style rifles with features like pistol grips and flash suppressors that were later outlawed by this post-Sandy Hook law. So, Lamont is trying to close what he believes is a loophole in that law, in addition to a handful of other things like banning open carry, limiting handgun purchases to one per month, and updating the registration system for ghost guns. But I just have to say that, I spoke with Chris Murphy a few weeks ago, and his push at the national level for the universal background check is because even though Connecticut does have what people consider strong gun laws, without a national universal background check system, there's still this leakage. So Hartford Police Chief Jason Thody said that there's a misconception that all the crimes, all the guns used in crimes are stolen, but only 16% of the guns on Hartford streets are stolen. So that means that, of the 367 guns used in crimes in Hartford, 58 were ghost guns, but 250 were purchased or transferred to a seller somewhere else in some other state and ended up in Hartford.
This is such an important topic, so important that we've brought Chip Brownlee in for the next segment. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk to Chip about this on this very point that Christine made. Mark, let's fast forward to the present moment here. Governor Ned Lamont, something that Christine was just talking about was this effort to re-register the assault weapons that were grandfathered in. Also, I understand that ghost guns, unregistered ghost guns, are going to be targeted in this session. What are ghost guns and why are they a problem?
Ghost guns are weapons that can be assembled at home, 3D printed or purchased, parts that are purchased and then assembled. And the problem is they don't have serial numbers. Now, it's legal to do that in Connecticut. You can be a hobbyist. You can build your own gun, but you're supposed to go to the state and get a serial number and make sure that's etched in the gun. And, as Christine just noted about the ghost guns that are recovered in Hartford, that is a growing problem. When that law was passed in Connecticut, it appeared to be a solution in search of a problem. There really were not a lot of ghost guns being found. Well, a few years later, it's now law enforcement says it is a huge problem. It is really part of the flow of guns into Connecticut. And so there's really no way to enforce the current law because the guns that were made before the ban were grandfathered. But if you don't have a serial number on a gun, how do you know when it was made? So it really made the law unenforceable, and that's the complaints of prosecutors.
This so-called iron pipeline, you have guns coming through this iron pipeline into Connecticut, and it's not always something that's convenient because it's not something you want to hear when we talk about gun violence. You want to hear like, oh, it's because the gun comes from the other state, but this is legit what people are dealing with. It's causing everyday gun violence. And speaking of everyday gun violence, community violence intervention programs is something I want to ask Christine about. How do programs like that kind of seek to address gun violence in Connecticut, Christine?
Well, I mean, they seek to make sure that there's no retaliation and to make sure that, guns don't end up in the hands of people just because they want to retaliate against somebody for something, or they feel that they have to have a gun for protection, so that some of these beefs on the street between these kids don't end up happening. And I think that there is bipartisan support to, increase funding for some of these programs. There is no opposition to violence intervention programs, even from Second Amendment groups. So I think that that's definitely something that's probably going to pass this year.
The flip side of that coin is trying to focus on just what she is saying, focus on where it is occurring. And, so the thing you have to understand about gun violence in Connecticut, first off, one of the reasons that overall the rates are low, it's not just these the gun bills we talked about. There's also things like risk warrants. Connecticut was the first state to do these risk warrants, these red flag laws, which allow police, health providers, and families to get guns away from people who may be in crisis, one form or another. And the feeling is the states that have those laws, that's where you also have the lowest number of gun deaths. But the community that Christine was talking about, basically the chief state's attorney said the other day that 70% of gun victims and 70% of shooters, they're really in a tight cohort of people who have felony convictions. They tend to be young and they tend to be male and urban. And there is also an effort going on that was pushed by the mayors to really tighten the laws regarding bail, of trying to really focus on this smaller community that is responsible for a lot of the violence. The chief state's attorney said basically almost 80% of gun violence, fatal and non-fatal, occurs in the cities of Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, and Waterbury. So this is an idea of trying to get focused on the enforcement side.
But this got really politicized because there was it came down to a lot of it was probation and more parole.
Probation, and bail. And you cannot deny bail in Connecticut under the Constitution. In federal court, you can. If somebody is deemed a threat, they can be denied bail. So this gets a little bit more complicated. We don't want to get too way into the weeds, but basically it would be making sure that bail bondsmen can't give these discount rates to get these guys out. It's about the use of bail bonds, about what percentage you should have to put up, and that is the legal window that they're trying to go through and tighten that law. That bill has not been filed yet. What the mayor's proposed is being drafted now. It's in the legislative commissioner's office, I'm told. So we'll see ultimately how that comes out and how it plays in a General Assembly that has been wary about tightening, about having more onerous punishments and whatnot. But go ahead.
And I think what we're kind of pointing to, Christine, is that things have gotten exacerbated in the pandemic, at least early on in the pandemic when it comes to gun violence, right? Is that there was this push that we had from like Mark is talking about, these local mayors. I think Aaron Stewart was a big one in this one. And the issue did get politicized, but the issue of gun violence becoming a little bit of a spike here in the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and gun violence did spike, but I mean, if you look at gun deaths overall, most of the gun deaths over the past decade have been suicide deaths. So I think that having the risk warrant and the red flag laws already established in Connecticut for decades has been helpful to make sure that people, I mean, if you choose to use a gun to commit suicide, you're most likely to succeed in that purpose. And so most of the gun deaths in Connecticut are still largely suicide.
Yeah, it's about 60%.
You already mentioned open carry before. Where does the Lamont administration stand on this? What are we talking about in terms of open carry for new legislation?
Well, Lamont is looking to ban open carry. In Connecticut, the law is basically gray, and it doesn't say anything necessarily about open carry. So he wants to ban open carry. He says that it would prevent the intimidation of residents at certain locations, such as polling places or protest. And this, the Second Amendment groups say that this isn't something that's necessarily happening. And most people don't open carry in Connecticut. The people who do, according to Holly Sullivan of the Connecticut Citizens Defense League, are those who are handicapped, and so that there's no way to holster the gun in any way or keep the gun hidden.
This has been a big piece of legislation that has been floated around the community that survived the Sandy Hook shooting. Since, I think, 2013, something like that, right after the shooting happened, the Newtown Action Alliance has pushed for a ban on open carry because of this idea of intimidation, Mark. And I think you covered it in one of your stories, but this idea that you would go to a protest or some kind of social justice rally and people would be walking around with the open carry, you could see the gun in the holster kind of thing on their leg.
We have not seen a lot of that in Connecticut, to be honest, right? I mean, there have been some very provocative demonstrations staged in other states, including dozens of people entering the state capitol in Wisconsin carrying long arms and pistols, and I think it's easy to say that was meant to intimidate. We have not seen that in Connecticut. Connecticut, at the Capitol, for example, firearms are banned if you're not law enforcement. But the broader question on that is it also help law enforcement? If you see somebody with a pistol tucked in their waist, under this proposal, an officer would have the right to go and demand to see, all right, do you have a permit? Explain how you have the gun. And as Christine said, right now it's a gray area. We did have an incident in a New Haven movie theater not long after the movie theater shooting in Colorado, where somebody had an open carry handgun, and the police were called, and he refused to show a permit. And it became this question of, okay, how do we determine what's going on here? Police can arrest somebody for a breach of peace, but that's a subjective thing about, are you, again, breaching the peace, or are you asserting your right to carry a gun under state law that is silent as to whether or not you need to show a permit?
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. Call in if you want to join this conversation. I'm with Mark Pazniokas, who's in studio. He's to my left right now. He's from the Connecticut Mirror, and from CT News Junkie. On the line right now is Christine Stewart. Call us if you want to talk, 888-720-WNPR. And I just want to go to a clip that I want to play for Mark and Christine right now. It comes from Mike Lawler. He's a professor at the University of New Haven. He's a criminal justice expert because he was actually Undersecretary for Criminal Justice in the Governor Daniel Malloy administration. I forgot his name already. Look at that. Look how far removed we are from Daniel Malloy. Please play the clip.
Much of the political back and forth centers around concerns that somehow guns are going to be universally banned in our state. And in my experience, no one has ever even come close to proposing anything like that. It's important for people to keep in mind that in addition to the Second Amendment in the United States Constitution, in our own state of Connecticut Constitution, it says explicitly citizens have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of themselves and the state.
You guys want to react to that? I'll start with Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Murphy and others try to make a similar argument, which is the Supreme Court in the Heller case has resolved the question of, does the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantee the right to possess firearms? And that is the court's interpretation. It's not just in a well-regulated militia. But to Mike Lawler's larger point, that is a talking point quite often, that these things will put the state on the slippery slope to seizing guns. Now, the governor, during his last campaign, actually raised that kind of prospect. He quickly backed off from it because there were Democratic legislators who said, this is not a road you want to go down. But during the campaign, he got tired of Bob Stefanowski saying he was weak on crime, and Stefanowski kept suggesting that the police accountability bill somehow had contributed to the murders of those two Bristol police officers who sources say were killed by somebody using a legally owned AR-15 or similar rifle. So Lamont said, if you're so concerned about guns, let's end the grandfather provision. Let's have those guns be surrendered. And as Mike Lawler said, that is a line that Connecticut and other states have never crossed. That is an explosive thing to do, and that's why that did not end up in any of the governor's bills that are before the legislature.
Christine, can you pivot off of Mark? Can you kind of talk about the challenges that are ahead for this administration on guns?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is closing what Lamont believes is the loophole in the 2013 law. I mean, he looks to, so assault weapon ban refers to center fire weapons or guns with a firing pin that strikes a primer in the center of an ammunition casing base. The new proposal is seeking to broaden this language to include rimfire weapons, which strike the primer of the casing's rim. So, I mean, the 2013 law, it was, really difficult for them to find bipartisan agreement on it, and they really struggled with that. And I think that by, looking to ban more of these weapons is not going to is not going to fly with lawmakers. And I don't think that lawmakers are necessarily focused on this issue. I would say that, inflation and the economy and affordable housing are topping the agenda this year, and gun policy is way far down on that list.
Real quick thought.
Yeah, and the importance of the center fire ammunition, if listeners who aren't into guns, that tends to be the more high velocity, high powered ammunition, such as 223 rounds that AR-15s fire and that were used at Sandy Hook to devastating effect.
Christine, I can listen to you talk about rimfire weapons all day. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. I appreciate it. And thank you guys for joining me here. I had Mark in studio and Christine on the phone. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for joining us. More on what's happening with gun laws in Connecticut and beyond after the break. If you want to call us, 888-720-WNPR is the number. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. So far today, we looked at the state of gun reform in Connecticut, which has some of the strongest gun laws in the United States. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit and see what's happening at the federal level. And joining us now, we have a great guest for you here, Chip Brownlee, a reporter at The Trace, a nonprofit newsroom focused on gun violence. Good morning, Chip.
Hey, good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for having us. And just before I pivot to you, I just want to say that 888-720-WNPR, it's 888-720-9677 is the number to call us if you want to participate. I think naturally the first question I want to ask you comes off of something Christine talked about earlier in the show. Christine Stewart joined us, a CT News junkie. She said that really some of the local police officers and lawmakers in the state of Connecticut are talking about, Connecticut's got great gun laws, but they're only as good as the other states that are around you, and maybe even some of the other states in the United States that have more loose restrictions on gun weapons. What can you say about that statement from Christine and some of the concern that lawmakers and local law enforcement have?
Right. I mean, that's definitely the case. I mean, we've seen all over the country that, a state can have as strong of gun laws as it wants, but if its neighboring states have weak gun laws, borders are porous and people travel between states. So if you can, I'm in New York, for example, so if you can pretty easily buy a gun in Pennsylvania, it's not that hard to just bring it right across the state line and either sell it illegally in New York or use it illegally here. There's no border checks between states, so it's not hard to bring those things across. And in New York, for example, I'm not sure about Connecticut specifically, but in New York, for example, something like more than 80% of crime guns in the state come from out of state. And so New York can have very strong gun laws, but it's easy to get guns into the state from elsewhere.
What are we seeing in the interim while we don't have these federal gun laws? What are we seeing states do to kind of, team up to try to avoid guns getting into this sort of iron pipeline that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so we are seeing states try to do things. So in the Northeast, for example, Governor Hochul in New York put together kind of an interstate task force with Connecticut, with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, some other states. That's trying to tackle some of these gun trafficking issues. What they're essentially trying to do is share information on like where the guns are coming from, how to better trace them, intelligence on how to track the guns, how they're being used, etc. I think, we could see that eventually have an effect. But as governors of these Northeast states, there's not much that they can do to, strengthen the gun laws in Virginia and Ohio and Georgia, where many of the crime guns originate, because those states have weaker gun laws and their background checks are just kind of the bare minimum that the federal law requires. So the governors can try to enhance the law enforcement capabilities that they have to track the guns and keep them from being used, but they can't really go at the source because they can't really control the other states that are being the sources of the guns.
So what about the relation between federal and state laws? Do they supersede state laws, or is it really what's happening in states is the lay of the land?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Federal laws kind of form the basis of the gun laws in the country. So there is a bare minimum requirement for federally licensed gun dealers to perform background checks. So that's true in every state. So if you go to a federally licensed gun dealer, which most gun stores are federally licensed, they have to be, you're going to get a background check there, for example. But in many states, there are still, private sales allowed without background checks that federal law doesn't touch. Now, some states have taken steps to put in universal background checks. So they're going above and beyond kind of the federal minimum requirement. Another example is, federal law sets in place some kind of basic prohibitions on who can and who cannot have guns. So for example, if you've been convicted of a felony, you're not allowed to have a gun. That's a federal law, but some states can go above and beyond that. And some states have. That's where you get into things like red flag laws that some states, Connecticut was the first to do it, that, is a way to take guns away from people who pose a threat to themselves or others. But I think, we've seen, as strong as the movement for gun reform has gotten really since Sandy Hook, there have been steps taken to put in place things like red flag laws in many states. On the flip side of that, there's also been a very strong movement in conservative states among pro-gun advocates to weaken gun laws, and that's been as strong, if not stronger in some ways, than the movement for gun reform.
Chip Brownlee is a reporter at The Trace. In a minute, we're going to talk about the gun measures that currently exist at the federal level, and we'll talk about some efforts to try to strengthen gun control in the United States. But first, we do have a caller on the line that's going to join us and wants to talk about the way that we talk about gun-related suicide. We have Tim from Higganum on the line. Tim, what's your question this morning? Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, I lost a very close family member to suicide about 10 months ago.
I'm sorry to hear, Tim.
It's been very difficult. One thing I learned from the process of facing that and trying to cope with it is that when we talk about suicide and we say someone has committed suicide, it lends a criminal implication to the act rather than addressing the terrible circumstances that led to it. And so it's actually more helpful for survivors of suicide and their family members to refer to it as a completed suicide. Just wanted to share that to raise awareness.
Thank you. And again, Tim, I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you for joining us on Where We Live this morning. Chip, anything you have to say about the way that we talk about gun deaths nationally, and maybe any kind of legislation that's inspired that or that's been inspired by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we often think about gun violence, and I think the thing that immediately comes to people's mind is, murder and homicide, but the majority of gun deaths in the U.S. are suicides. So last year, there were more than 24,000 suicides compared to like 20,000 homicides. So that is a big issue that often kind of goes unaddressed when we talk about gun violence. There are some things that can help, in red flag laws, for example. There's actually stronger evidence that red flag laws can help prevent suicide than there is, that they have an effect on homicide and murders. So there are steps that can be taken. Some other things are things like safe storage laws that can prevent, kids and teenagers from being able to access guns. There's strong evidence to say that those types of laws can prevent suicides as well.
I very much appreciate your answer, Chip, because it was really important, I thought, to get Tim's call in because of what he wanted to talk about. So thank you so much for that. And that leads me to this. When you talk about red flag legislation, recently Congress made it so that states can start to get some funding for red flag legislation. It sounded like in the aftermath of the mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, we saw the first real significant federal gun legislation in 3 decades. Why was that such an important milestone, this bipartisan Safer Communities Act?
I think it was an important milestone because it did do something. I think for a long time we thought, Congress is deadlocked. They're never going to do anything on gun reform. And them being able to get that bill passed last year, thanks in large part to Senator Murphy, it showed that Congress can take some action on this issue. And I think it did reinvigorate some hope that there could be, more changes in the future. I don't know that there's going to be any more immediate changes like in the next year or two. I think that's pretty unlikely, but it did show that Congress can take action. And I think the law is going to have some effects. It strengthened background checks, especially for people that are under 21. It essentially put in place waiting periods for people that are under 21. It took some steps to close the boyfriend loophole that was present in some of our domestic violence laws around gun violence.
Yes, we talk so much about suicide, but there's also the domestic violence component as well. These gun deaths happening to people so close within the shooter.
Yeah, I mean, most gun deaths happen, between people that know each other. Really, about a third of the, homicides that happen in the U.S. are in some way related to domestic violence, whether that be between partners or between, close family members. And so there are definitely steps that could be taken, to address some of those loopholes that are still in place nationally when it comes to like domestic violence laws.
So besides this legislation that took 30 years, what do we really have at the federal level?
Right now, I don't think we're going anywhere in the next year or two. With Republicans in control of Congress, it's unlikely that they're going to agree to any new federal gun laws. We still have the basic bedrock gun laws that are in place, the minimum background check requirements, for example. But on the flip side of that, last year there was the ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, which basically expanded the Supreme Court's interpretation of gun rights and said, not only do you have a right to have a gun in your home for self-defense, you also have a constitutional right to carry a loaded gun in public. And we're seeing that reverberate across different states and affect different federal laws. For example, there's just tons of court cases right now that, we could see major changes coming down the pipeline. I think the biggest movement on the federal level right now is the impacts of that Supreme Court case that we're going to be seeing over the next few years.
I'm imagining this like I'm playing poker and I got my hand that I'm playing against the House. Then you got, it sounds like the Supreme Court that you have to worry about. You got to worry about now the Senate filibuster. Then you also have the House changing majority rule. It looks like the Republicans have an advantage in the House now. So if you're looking for gun legislation, I think this is relevant to the conversation. Sorry to get poker in here, but it's relevant to the conversation because if you're a Chris Murphy and you're looking to pass some universal background legislation, we talked about in the last segment, something that you're familiar with here, this universal background check legislation that would be in the federal government, you've really got the deck stacked against you.
Yeah. I mean, I was actually at an event yesterday where Senator Murphy spoke, and he was asked essentially about the universal background check legislation that he's brought forward for years, and if there was any possibility that it could go through this year, and he, in not so many words, basically said no. I think it's just very hard to get anything through Congress on guns right now. Because of Republican control in the House and because Democrats don't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And even though things like universal background checks have 80, 85, 90, 95% support, depending on which poll you look at, Republicans just don't support it. And the main reason that's the case is because they're, trying to appeal to their base in their primary elections, and those base voters in primary elections, especially, on the Republican side, don't support any changes to gun laws. because they view it as a slippery slope towards, y'all were talking earlier about gun seizures and whether you could fully ban guns. They think anything, even a background check, is a step towards that, even though that's not the case. And we've seen with the Supreme Court rulings that if anything, the Supreme Court has strengthened gun rights. It's harder now for states to pass gun regulations because of that ruling. Over the past 10 years, most states have weakened their gun laws. That's another thing we could talk about is permitless carry. Most states in the country now allow people to carry guns without a permit in public loaded. That was just not true 20, 30 years ago. That it's true now. So if anything, a lot of states have weakened their gun laws. And so the cards are kind of stacked against people who are trying to get gun reform through.
We're winding down here. I got a couple of things I want to say just really quickly. At the federal level, our senators from Connecticut, we mentioned Chris Murphy talking about a background check bill, but these guys are really invested in gun violence legislation because of the Sandy Hook school shooting that happened 10 years ago, that they were both responding to the scene that day at the firehouse. U.S. Senators from Connecticut, Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal, saying they want to introduce the federal assault weapons ban, and separately, they're calling for a federal law to raise the age you can purchase assault weapons from 18 to 21. Kind of sounds utopian at this point, Chip, but I just want to give you this one last thing here. This poll, a new poll from Gallup, shows that 63% of Americans are dissatisfied with U.S. gun laws, a new high. Why is there such a disconnect between the public and the people that represent them in Congress?
I think there's a couple of things. One is the influence of the gun lobby. We've seen that, weakened over the last decade. The NRA has lost a lot of members and money, but I mean, there's still a strong lobbying force. But I think the main thing, again, goes back to, polarization, gerrymandering, the way that we run primaries in this country. There's just really not an incentive for Republicans to come to the table on gun laws. Even last year, when they were debating the gun law, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the senator from Texas, who was kind of the Republican in charge of that, being the kind of Republican in those negotiations, went home and basically got attacked for participating in those negotiations. So there's just not an incentive for Republicans to come to the table. I think something like an assault weapons ban, President Biden has promised to keep pushing for that, but until there's some kind of change in the composition of Congress, I don't see how that could get through.
Yeah, a lot to be a lawmaker nowadays, as a lot of the sentiment that was around January 6th seemed to be around gun laws and this insurrectionist kind of philosophy. It seemed that it was a lot of that paranoia of guns being taken away is kind of what led folks to Washington on January 6th. So a lot going on for lawmakers, a lot going on at the Trace, if you could check it out. Chip Brownlee, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you to Chip, and thank you to folks that are calling in today, 888-720-9677. If you want to get a hold of us today, we're going to move away from guns and talk about Medicaid next on Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We got to pivot away from the gun laws and legislation to something else that affects Connecticut residents in a major way. In the coming weeks, thousands of Nutmeggers, especially low-income residents, understand that individuals with disabilities as well are expected to lose Medicaid coverage if they don't act soon. But why exactly is that happening? And what can these people do? To answer those questions and more, I am so blessed today. Had a guest in studio earlier in the A segment, and now we're joined by one of my favorite colleagues, Sujata Srinivasan, our Connecticut public health reporter.
Good morning, Frankie. Right back at you, one of my favorite colleagues. So the first thing to know is not to panic. We've had more than enough panic these 3 years, and the state has many safety nets. But the thing to do is, like you rightly pointed out, start taking action. So the last 3 years, many folks, thousands of folks were enrolled as Medicaid beneficiaries, and they were continuously enrolled. And that's because in 2020, Congress put in place the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. States were required to continuously enroll people for Medicaid coverage, regardless of eligibility. So otherwise, they would have come up for redetermination or the process to qualify for Medicaid coverage. So regardless of people's income status, let's say somebody got a better job, got more income, doesn't matter. They were continuously enrolled for Medicaid regardless of their income criteria and eligibility criteria. Now that's coming to an end March 31st, and it's coming up for 430,000 Nutmeggers.
And there's this is going to happen over the next year, this process will play out. There's the deadline, but then there's 12 months here of this sort of unwinding?
Absolutely, and it has to be that way because people are not going to wake up April 1st and go, oh gosh, where's my coverage? No, it's not going to be that way. But the first step is to notify the Department of Social Security if people have had an address change. And DSS has put out ads the last couple of weeks, more than a month actually, intensified in areas where Medicaid recipients are concentrated. So New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport. They have an Update Us so we can update you campaign. It's all over the place, including buses and signages. So that's the first step because some of these people haven't been in contact with DSS for 3 years now. And DSS needs the addresses because individuals are going to be contacted by DSS. They'll be given a date by which to respond manually to renew coverage. So that's the important process. And I spoke with Jennifer Tolbert, who is a Medicaid analyst for the Kaiser Family Foundation. And that's the biggest concern in this process, that there are going to be people who will lose their Medicaid coverage even though they are eligible, just because they have not notified their addresses.
So I just want to underscore this. If you or someone you know, we're going to say this a couple of times, if you or someone you know is in danger of losing coverage, you can visit portal.ct.gov/update USDSS, portal.ct.gov, update USDSS. This renewal process that we're talking about, if you changed your address, you want to make sure that you let DSS know. But this is because they have a passive renewal process, right?
Yeah, there's a passive renewal process. And the DSS told me that this year they expect about a 9% increase in people that cannot be passively determined as being eligible. So that volume is going to go up.
So
and
you
so that's the computerized renewal process.
Yes. So you said, and as I understand it, after that, they're hoping that they're able to address, DSS will hopefully address this as well, but the rest of them. But this is something like you said, 435,000 people in Connecticut that are affected. And we really want to pinpoint it. We want to drill down on it. Who's the most impacted population, would you say?
Well, for Medicaid, it's going to be people of color, definitely children, but also in this cohort, going to be people whose income, fortunately, has risen during the pandemic and are no longer eligible. Now, these people who will not qualify for Medicaid, they have other options available for them. So for people who are affected, it's time to start thinking about transitional medical assistance. It's going to be 12 months of medical coverage provided for people who lost Husky A coverage. And there's Covered Connecticut program. Now, that's also administered by the DSS. And Covered Connecticut, the state's going to pay all premium and all copay. So if a person is eligible for zero premium, and that's people earning up to 175% of the federal poverty level, which is about $30,000 for a family of four now, they will be eligible for the Covered Connecticut program. And then, of course, the plans on the state healthcare exchange.
DSS, what are they doing in all of this? There's some kind of campaign. I think it's at that website that I sent folks to, but there's some kind of campaign they have maybe with billboards and something happening in Bridgeport, as I understand it.
Yeah, so there's this campaign. I mean, the first step is, update us, update you, and, the DSS is trying to get everyone to update their addresses. That's the first step. But even it's important to follow up. Make sure that if they don't hear back from people, to follow up. That's important. DSS also at a February hearing, public hearing, Jennifer Marsochi of DSS in February said that they've hired more people to man the call centers, given the call volume. To handle all this. This is going to be, the volumes and the fact that people are transitioning to other health coverages, and the fact that, we don't want people to fall through the gaps and miss coverage for that period of time. So they are increasing the staffing. So the concern is to train the staff if they are new, and to follow up with people if they don't hear back, and to ensure that the pacing of the process, goes smoothly as few people falling through the gaps, which is inevitable.
I'm so happy that you came on to talk about this, and I'm so excited that our producer Meg Dalton wanted to talk about this, because there's that urgency, right? March 31st, and you're talking generally about people who are on Husky A and Husky D. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I just want to underscore how important it is for folks to visit this website if they may be impacted. Portal.ct.gov/update USDSS. And folks, if it doesn't really work as well, we know how sometimes state systems can be. Please let us know so in the next month or so we can follow up on this and try to help you out. You could also reach out to Sujata. Give us your email address so people can send tips if they need to.
Oh gosh, so it's S. Srinivasan, that's S as in Sam, R as in Robert, I as in ink, N as in Nancy, I as in ink, V as in Victor, A as in America, S as in Sam, A as in America, N as in Nancy at ctpublic.org. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you're having trouble, that's what we are here for, to inquire and to make sure that there's accountability and everything goes smoothly.
Sujata and I both have long names, so we're really fluent in the phonetic alphabet. Really quickly, I do want to play something. I'm going to play a clip in a second. I want to talk about not only this unwinding scenario, but the politics and how Medicaid has been politicized. Here's Joe Courtney, U.S. Congressman from Connecticut.
Aside from the unwinding of the pandemic system, we're about to enter into what I would describe as a very nasty budget debate, in terms of proposals now with the new majority in the House that could really threaten the existing levels of Medicaid scope and eligibility.
This is our last question of the day, Sujata. What are your thoughts on what Congressman Courtney just said?
It's a real concern. With the Republican-controlled House, I took a look at the federal, the Republican Study Committee's roadmap that they put out last year, and Georgetown policy analyst Edwin Park has concerns that they haven't really spelled out how this could play out, but in some sort of exchange to raise the debt ceiling, it could be exchanged for some budget cuts that includes Medicaid block grants. So Connecticut, all states receive some federal assistance as well as state to provide Medicaid, and for Connecticut it's 56% of whatever the cost of providing Medicaid coverage is. So whatever the cost, it's 56% of it. That could be capped. So that's one option. Or the other is to eliminate provider taxes, which is basically something like what hospitals and healthcare services pay to finance Medicaid, and states do that. So that's something that was outlined in the Republican Study Committee, and that's a concern.
Thank you so much for Sujata to come on today. This is going to be a very important issue for people to follow. If you or someone you know is in danger of losing coverage, you can visit portal.ct.gov/update USDSS. Thank you for Sujata for joining us today on Where We Live. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton. Our first show together. Here we freaking go. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Thank you for listening to Where We Live today.